This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Welcome to Disabled Persons Assembly's Notable Radio Show. DPA is a systemic advocacy organisation run by and for disabled people. DPA is a pan-impaired organisation with members across the country. Over the next half hour, we'll discover how we can work collaboratively to achieve inclusion for all New Zealanders. DPA's Notable Radio Show, a whole new attitude.
Kia ora and welcome to DPA's Notable Radio. I'm your host, Amy Taylor. Today we're talking about a number of recent changes in disability funding in Aotearoa and a growing fear in our community that disabled people and their caregivers are being asked to carry more with less support at a time where the cost of living is simply through the roof. The simple task of existing is becoming somewhat overwhelming for the disabled community. 4 recent government actions are of particular concern. Firstly, the recent restructure of the Lottery's Individuals with Disabilities Fund. Now, this is all up in the air as our Minister for Disabilities has put up on her Facebook that we have all got the wrong end of the stick with this change. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Secondly, a recent proposed cuts to the total mobility scheme that are coming in I think it's July. Then we have Kaiongora's abandonment of the 15% accessible homes goal. They were supposed to be building 15% of their homes to universal design standards, and that goal has been abandoned in the last couple of weeks. And lastly, and this only came to light on Monday, and it is currently dominating the disability media and really upsetting a number of prominent disability advocates. Our government's bill aimed at overturning the Supreme Court decision that recognised family carers as employees of the state. So let's first talk about the Lottery's Individuals with Disability grants. So it came out in the media a couple of weeks ago that the disability grants from lotteries has been restructured. This is a number of restructuring causing the committees to be more on a regional level and to get rid of specialist committees. This fund helps many disabled people pay for things like mobility vans, assistance dogs and specialist equipment, and it is apparently being removed. But we don't know this for sure because the post that our minister put up a couple of days ago clarifying that this fund, we have misinterpreted this and individuals will still be able to apply to this fund. The Facebook post was removed. The D-list actually inquired to the Department of Internal Affairs whether this fund was actually being removed and disabled people would no longer be able to apply for things like mobility vans. And the Department of Internal Affairs came back to them and said, that is correct. The disabled people, individuals, will no longer be able to apply for things like mobility vans and assistance dogs and a number of other things, and that it would be now a more community-focused fund. Now, let's be clear. Mobility vans can cost over $100,000 when modifications are included. Assistance dogs and other specialist equipment are also extremely expensive. For many people, these are not extras. They're the difference between actually being able to participate in your society. Something that is often missed, and I haven't mentioned it yet, is that Lottery's Individuals with Disabilities grant was, up until these changes, the only way that chronically ill members of our community could access wheelchairs, funded wheelchairs, because most people with chronic illness are shoehorned into the long-term chronic illness health funding pathway, which is a different and very much more restricted criteria for wheelchair funding than for most disabled people. Lotteries has traditionally filled the gap in this hugely inequitable system where our health system has fallen short. So personally, And I like to share personal anecdotes on this radio show because I think that when you get to know disabled people, you can actually have a better idea of the real struggles that we are experiencing. I am very lucky to have been the recipient of wheelchair funding from the Lotteries Fund just the week before last. This change was then instated. And so actually I was probably one of the last people that actually got to access this fund. And had this not been the case, I would have been forced to either take out a loan for a new wheelchair or resort to crowdfunding. So just as an aside, crowdfunding is becoming one of the only avenues available for the chronically ill community to access wheelchairs. And this is deeply disturbing, as it means that disabled people are having to lay bare their medical information in a very public way, simply to obtain essential equipment. Now, I want to make it clear to you that the wheelchair that I am obtaining is not a particularly high-end chair. It's a very small power chair, and the cost is something around $7,000. So to be out of pocket that much is a really huge thing. So the changes to the lottery funding means that this funding will shift towards organisations and broader community projects. And while community programs are essential, there is actually a range of other funding avenues for community programs. The Lotteries Individuals with Disability Fund was one of the only avenues available for funding mobility support for disabled individuals. Without special disability expertise on this panel, people who understand disabilities have been taken away from the table. So there's a fear that accessibility needs will increasingly be misunderstood or deprioritized. On that note, it's time to talk about total mobility, another aspect of transport for the disabled community. So at the same time, people are facing these major changes to the Total Mobility scheme. Total Mobility currently subsidises taxi fare for disabled people who cannot use public transport independently. But as of July 2026, the subsidy will drop from a maximum of 75% to 65%. On top of this, there will be a 10% cut to the maximum subsidy cap. So, as Dr. Huhanahiki points out, for many disabled people, taxis are not a luxury. They are a lifeline. Now, this sounds to most people to be a fairly small cut. So, we're talking about a 10% drop in the subsidy and a 10% drop in the maximum subsidy cap. So, let's talk about what this actually means for some real-world examples. The costs involved for disabled people realistically are rather different. So I want to talk about a trip to the Mosgiel pool from Dunedin town. Mosgiel has the only accessible pool in the city. It offers a high-temperature therapy pool. For Dunedin city-based disabled people, the cost of access to the facility via Total Mobility is already extremely high. The full taxi cost from the city to Mosgiel is currently approximately $70 each way. With the current fare cap of $50 and the 75% subsidy, users can expect to pay around $32.50 each way. With the new fare cap of $45 and a 65% subsidy, users can expect to pay $40.75. This is an approximately a 25% fare increase on already a very heavy travel cost. And it's important to contrast this to what other people in the community experience in terms of travel costs. The IRD cost for a private vehicle to travel from the city to Mosgiel is set at $17 per kilometre. So multiply that by the distance of 16 kilometres and you get $18.72. In contrast to the $40.75 a disabled person dependent on Total Mobility will pay. So it's already costing our disabled community something like twice as much for their travel as a typical individual using a private vehicle. So please remember that when subsidies are reduced, people don't simply adjust. They stop travelling altogether. They cancel appointments and become isolated because they can't afford to absorb these huge cost increases. I'm going to give you another example. One of our local members' fare to her University of the Third Age meeting is $16.50. That means she paid 25% up to the cap of $50, which equals $12.50, plus the full amount over the cap, in this case $4. So her normal taxi fare, if she wasn't using total mobility, would have been $54.50. Under the new fare system, she would pay up to 35% up to the new fare cap of $45 or $15.70 plus the extra above the cap. So that's $9.50 above the cap. So her total fare would go up from $16.50 currently to $25.25, which is an increase of 54%. So when people speak about a 10% increase, which sounds very minimal, it's not actually taking into account how these things are calculated. We need to look to how disabled people get around. When accessible transport disappears, disabled people disappear from public life. Dunedin is already a place where people struggle with steep terrain, limited accessible taxis, inaccessible footpaths, and reduced evening transport services in terms of buses. So this is actually... People underestimate the impact of this total mobility change. Now let's talk about Aotearoa or Housing New Zealand. Housing New Zealand is about to abandon its 15% accessible homes goal. So Aotearoa has quietly abandoned its 15% universal design housing goal a couple of weeks ago in the interest of saving money. And when the government saves money, the disabled community must pay. This goal likely went nowhere close to actually meeting the accessible housing needs. Remember, in the sector of the community that uses state housing, the need for accessible housing is rather higher than in the general community. And yet it was abandoned without any further explanation beyond prioritising financial viability. Unfortunately, it appears that disability rights are rather low on the priority list of Housing New Zealand. Now, lastly, I come to talk about the Disability Support Services view. This is a major concern over the last week. This only came to light on Monday. So the government is moving to overturn a Supreme Court decision recognising some family carers as government employees via the Disability Support Services Bill. There was a Supreme Court decision involving parents providing full-time care to severely disabled adult children. In this decision, the Supreme Court found that in some situations, carers could legally be considered employees of the state and entitled to employment protections such as minimum wage and leave entitlements. But the government has announced plans to legislate against this decision via the so-called Disability Support Services Bill. This bill would overturn the Supreme Court decision that family carers are employees of the state and negate any claims that are currently working their way through the courts. So basically what the government is doing is it's pulling the rug from under the feet of people that are legitimately taking their claims through our court system. And this echoes to me what the government did in the pay equity legislation by simply removing the rights for people to take pay equity claims to the courts. The clear statement from the government is that families and whānau have the responsibility for the well-being of their family members in the first instance. So basically, natural care must come before care from the state. which can be read as the government is off the hook when it comes to caring for disabled people. It's the family's responsibility, and basically don't expect any financial support. Family carers provide care across the clock. This includes but isn't limited to medication management, personal care, behavioural support, advocacy and transport. It is more than a full-time job. It's a 24-hour a day, 7 days a week without rest job. If this work was carried out by specially trained support workers, it would carry a very significant cost. And as such, the work done by family carers already saves the state millions of dollars a year. However, family carers are people. They still need to eat and pay their rent. Many family carers live in poverty, experience burnout, and have little access to respite or employment protections. They're not able to work in traditional employment due to their extensive caregiving role. They don't have the same 24 hours in a day. The government is trying to legislate relying heavily on the goodwill of family carers, and this is simply to cut costs. And this, without putting too fine a point on it, is going to lead to some dire consequences for members of our disabled community and their caregivers. So we really need to stand up against this proposed bill. Write your submissions. Let the government know that we absolutely do not agree with this proposed legislation. So this all comes in an environment where disabled people are already feeling really distrustful of our government. We're already feeling undermined. Disabled people in Aotearoa, New Zealand are still living with the legacy of recent disability funding restrictions. So to remind you, in 2024, strict purchasing rules were introduced that limit how disabled people can use their flexible funding. This change caused significant distress across the community, and we came out in full force. We took to the streets to protest these changes. Although some of the restrictions have now been removed, many disabled people experienced lasting harm and uncertainty. They also removed most of the power from our ministry at the same time. One disabled person who was interviewed by RNZ said that the community felt that they were just meant to say thank you and ignore the fact that their lives had been hugely disrupted after some funding flexibility was later restored. So in conclusion, the wider concern is that disabled people are being expected to prove their worthiness for support while navigating systems that are already exhausting and difficult to access. I say this many times a week. It feels like a full-time job, simply accessing the support we are entitled to. I spend many of my own unpaid time dealing with paperwork and bureaucracy simply to access the basic care needs of support for myself and my family. We're endlessly having to justify why we need absolute basics like care, home help, and wheelchairs. There's a growing fear for the future. The cuts to disability support seem relentless, and this proposed bill is potentially opening the doors for extensive means testing in how we receive disability support, which is already in place for some parts of our disabled community, like the chronically ill community. I was expressing a wish for access legislation, which the previous Labour government had suggested. And I was saying this to people online, but I had to admit that at this time, advocates are spending all their time trying to maintain the supports we have. We have very little in our mental health tank, number of spoons to advocate for more. So unfortunately, access legislation feels like a bit of a pipe dream at the moment. Right now, many disabled people and carers are already surviving off very limited incomes. Many are beneficiaries. Some work, like myself, but are limited to the number of hours they can work by the fact that they are experience disability. We face huge additional disability-related costs, and many of the avenues, like the Lotteries Individuals with Disabilities Fund, that are available to cover these costs are being stripped away from us. However, on a positive note, despite this, the disabled community continues to advocate. On social media, you can see that we are a united community. People are on the same side, and we continue to challenge the systems that treat disabled lives as financial liabilities rather than human beings deserving dignity, safety, and participation. Human beings with human rights. Disabled people and carers are experts in what accessibility actually looks like. It's important that our government remembers that we are signatories of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Our government is simply ignoring many of its obligations under this international agreement. And in light of this, we must continue to fight for disabled people as equal people with full rights to access to society. We must not stand for these cuts. We need to make our voices heard. Take the time to write your submissions. Contact the oppositions. Contact your local MP and make your voice heard on these issues. Because if we don't speak out, we will not get the desired outcome for our rights. Kia ora, and thank you for listening to DPA's Notable Radio. I'm your host, Amy Taylor.
Disabled Persons Assembly is Aotearoa, New Zealand's first pan-disability national organisation, providing system-level advocacy for all disabled people. Membership is free for individuals. If you'd like to know more, visit our national website at www.dpa.org.nz or contact your local kaituitui or community connector, Amy Taylor, at kaituitui.otipoti@dpa.org.nz. Disabled Persons Assembly, a whole new attitude.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.